Okay, so welcome back to part two. This will be a little bit shorter than part one, and I appreciate you hanging in there. So where we left off, we were talking about, and I'll go back to this slide here, the 7,225 registered literary magazines at Duotrope. That is a lot of literary magazines. How could there possibly be that much paper? Well, like I had said, there's both print and online literary magazines. Um, Online literary magazines have completely changed the literary magazine landscape. Up until the 90s, when we actually had the internet to use for open access to materials, reading materials online, not just chat rooms and um, encyclopedias and basically like vault storage. Um, there was a greater accessibility for people to create literary magazines too. Or as is here's Granta right here. Granta actually has online and print versions. And a lot of literary magazines are not just here's a print version and here's an online version. They have different stories in print and different stories that can be accessed online. Um, Fairy Tale Review, which is here, and I can see the image isn't very clear for you guys, so I apologize, is one that also has an online version and a print version. And this week you're going to be reading the print version, which is free right now during the pandemic, which is pretty cool because it usually costs $15 per issue to read. So there's a really healthy, active market for literary magazines. And what I wanted to do is I'm going to just jump out of this for a second, and I'm going to show you through my Duotrope subscription an example of one of these literary magazines. So just to explain what Duotrope is, for writers who are submitting their work to literary magazines, agents, publishers, etc., Duotrope is like a, I can't even think of the word right now. It's like the yellow pages of an index, I guess you could say that's the only word, an index of literary magazines. And Three Penny Review is probably one of the more popular literary magazines that's out there. It's been around since 1980, so you can see that here. And it gives a breakdown of what they publish. A lot of literary magazines right now that publish short stories are shortening their word counts. And what does that even mean? What does that mean to you? Well, as we move through a culture that is becoming more and more about instant gratification, syncopation, compression, we're seeing that desire reflected in literature itself. And I'll either mention, I can't remember if I mentioned this last lecture, and I believe I did, or I will since this is a future lecture. For instance, Twitter literature. I assigned you guys the 3 winning entries from the Fairy Tale Review Flash Twitter contest. 160 character story, right? Um, so because people are liking this flash fiction more and more, because it falls within a category of interaction with texts and stories that we have during the day. Think about just in communicating with somebody through text message, if you're telling them about your day or having a conversation, it's fragmented oftentimes. Sometimes it happens over a period of days, right? It used to be when we first started texting, you could send a text and you'd get a return text in 3 days and it wouldn't be a weird thing. Now, if you go 3 days without hearing from somebody, you've already called the police to say that they've gone missing or whatever. Our expectations of communication have changed, and our expectations of entertainment change, which means our expectations of literature begins to change. If I were to go, for instance, I wasn't planning on doing this, but thinking about flash fiction magazines have become a lot more popular. So this is just gives recent responses from publishers. And even looking in this for today, Brilliant Flash Fiction is an up-and-coming literary magazine. Passages North publishes flash fiction. Smokelong Quarterly Award for Flash Fiction. You can see just in this 24-hour period right now, 50-word stories. A large portion of the publisher responses indicate that these are literary magazines that publish very, very short fiction. And I anticipate that the more we start paying attention to this, the more we start consuming short fiction, the more it starts changing the taste of the general population, and the more we're going to start seeing these abbreviated texts, which means we're going to start seeing different types of stories. I always give the analogy of look at Netflix. Before we had streaming, we used to wait for new episodes to come out for a week, sometimes 2 weeks if there was a lag. And now you get the release of an entire season all at once, and it's still broken up into episodes, but if you look at it, the episodes all have different lengths. So when I worked at Big Bang Theory and Two and a Half Men, and I have a box of scripts, right? If I go through the scripts, they're all going to be the same page length because you have a 30-minute time slot, 22 minutes of show, and then 8 minutes of commercial breaks and title sequences. So it was very set, whereas now the context is different. With streaming, there's no having to fit into a certain time. People are able to fit stories into their lives instead of fitting their lives into the story time, if that makes sense. And so fiction does the same thing. But now you have episodes on Netflix, like one will be 47 minutes, one will be 55 minutes, one will be an hour and 3 minutes, because that's how long it takes to tell the story. With literary magazines, the constraint is usually how many pages they can afford to publish, and how many stories they generally take. So, and how much they pay per page, right? So, for instance, Prism International pays $25 a page. So if they say, this is our budget for this issue, we can afford 150 pages or whatever to pay the contributors. Not all literary magazines pay. But anyway, going back to literary magazines, these literary magazines, more and more are publishing flash, where people can sit down and read a story in one sitting. Short stories were originally written that way to be consumed in a single sitting, but we don't do it like that anymore because our lives are distracted by our phones and our working from home and whatnot. And so flash suddenly becomes that one moment of being consumed. And I recently did an interview, and I don't know when it's coming out, but I recently did an interview about being a flash writer. And I'm not just a flash writer. Like, I have work that's much longer in the 6,000 word range, 10,000 words even. But when it comes to reading flash fiction and writing it, it's very cinematic, right? Like, it feels like a scene in a movie that you can't turn away from. That's what good flash is. And these magazines are starting to realize that. So even, really long-standing literary magazines that still take long pieces are starting to create their own flash fiction sections. Right? So that, and I said this video is going to be shorter, and I apologize, I'm already going over time. But that leads me into, if you have any questions about Duotrope, I know I have some writers out there, if you have any questions about Duotrope, you can let me know. But this leads me into a discussion of what you're going to be reading this week. So, originally we were going to be reading collections of short stories, which is great, because the author intended for those stories to be together. But I also think it's really interesting for you to see what an issue of a literary magazine looks like. And one of the really cool things, like I said earlier, was that Fairy Tale Review made all of its issues, including the current Coral issue, free for you guys to read, for all of us to read, for all of us to enjoy. And it's through JSTOR, so the link that I'm going to give you guys on Canvas will be through JSTOR, which is one of our databases. There's probably another link too, but I'll just give the JSTOR one. And this gives the breakdown of contents. I'm really proud to know a couple of the writers in here. Matt Bell is great. Champion is actually a flash fiction. So this, again, an example of seeing these literary magazines that have been around for a while publishing more flash fiction. But there's also poetry in here. And I would really like for you to read as much of the issue as possible just to get a sense of the entire issue. And also because with your reading response assignment, you'll be asked to respond to one or two pieces that speak to each other. East Texas is great by Todd Dillard. Erin Rodini, who's in here somewhere. Oh, Artemis is a friend of mine from my MFA program. She's a writer and professor out in San Francisco, and she and I have been sharing content this semester. So there's some really great stuff in here. So I'd like for you guys to really set aside some time for yourself to sit down and read the literary magazine. You don't have to read it all at once, right? The great part is that you have of a literary magazine is you have a lot of different dispatches in it, so you can skip around if you want. But I'd like for you to look at it. And obviously, because it's fairy tale review, we've talked about what the classic fairy tale is and the 4 aspects of the fairy tale, the abstraction, flatness of character, the intrinsic logic, and the normalized magic. You're going to see deviation from that, and maybe there'll be a developed character, maybe there'll be something else, but how do these fall into the new idea of fairy tale? And I'd like for you to read the digital version from cover to cover, so that you can see the front matter here is what this is called, and it gives you that list of editors who worked so tirelessly to put this out. And it's cute. They have some fun stuff here. Kate Bernheimer, we read her essay in class about fairy tale as form as fairy tale. She is the founding editor and still works on it. And there's a lot of other lovely people working on fairy tale review, and you get to see the epigraph here. An epigraph is a quote that sets off the tone for a story or a book. All those quotes that come at the beginning of a story are epigraphs. So in this one, it's resilience is the nature of living things, which is actually kind of hopeful right now for me anyway, to know that we'll get through this because we are resilient. An annotated table of contents is pretty cool. So it gives you an insight into what you're going to read. And yeah, so anyway, I'm going to stop there for right now. I appreciate you guys hanging with the video. And I will be looking forward to your reading response to this assignment.